Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Tony Okely y soy de la University of Wollongong, Australia. My talk will focus on how we can promote a more active world for our children. Obesity itself is a direct cause of many morbidities in childhood and adolescence and accelerates the onset of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. Obesity in childhood can also contribute to behavioural and emotional difficulties such as depression, and can also lead to stigmatisation and poor socialisation and reduce educational attainment. Globally, a high proportion of our school-aged and preschool-aged children are overweight or obese. What might surprise you, though, is that most of these children live in low or middle income countries, with only a very small proportion in high income countries. This raises the question, what has happened to cause this high and increasing prevalence of overweight and obesity among children under 5 years of age, especially those who live in low or middle income countries? Here is an example of what the world might look like for a child growing up in a low or middle income country today. He may live in an urban area of one of these countries where there has been an increasing degree of urbanisation seen. As you can see on this map, most of the countries with large urban areas are in, most of the cities with large urban areas are in low or middle income countries. And in these countries, urbanisation has increased dramatically over the past 10 to 15 years, bringing with it a whole range of challenges in controlling environments in which children grow up in, and which may promote or be detrimental to their physical, mental, and emotional health. Now, there are many factors that influence childhood obesity, as you can see here. And in response to this, the Commission on Ending Childhood Obesity developed a report that was welcomed by the World Health Assembly, and in response asked the World Health Organization to develop an implementation plan to be able to address these high and increasing rates of childhood obesity. This report provides guidance on how to promote healthy food habits and eating behaviours, and it takes a settings-based approach, which has been further enhanced recently with the Global Action Plan on Physical Activity and the encouragement to take a systems-based approach which incorporates a range of settings into responses. So this provides guidance here. And what I would like to do today is not so much focus on the food side, but rather the other side of the energy balance equation, movement behaviours. I want you to think of movement as existing on a continuum ranging from sleep to vigorous physical activity. More recently, there has been an encouragement to not just consider these behaviours in isolation, but to acknowledge that the whole day matters. That is, that these behaviours coexist and are interrelated, and that it is the composition of these behaviours, what we refer to as 24-hour movement behaviours, that is important. So, for example, a child may be adequately active, meet the physical activity guidelines, which we know is going to be good for their health, but they can undo the benefits that they get from being physically active if they don't get enough sleep, because they're spending too much time in sedentary behaviour, in particular engaging with electronic media for recreation. In recognition of this, the World Health Organization developed for the first time guidelines for children under the age of 5. And these guidelines incorporate a 24-hour approach with a focus on promoting physical activity, sedentary behaviour, which includes screen time and sleep, in infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. So there's an acknowledgement here that the whole day matters, and it's the composition of these behaviours, that is doing them all together, that is really important. Now, when it comes to looking at the evidence upon which these guidelines and much of what else we know about these 24-hour movement behaviours in young children is taken from, there is a significant limitation. And that limitation is not just in our field, but it goes across a number of ages and a number of different behaviours as well. And this was highlighted in this paper some years ago, which looked at where we draw the evidence from. In other words, where publications relating to physical activity and transportation and ICT are derived. And this map was something that was striking to me when I first saw it. The top figure represents the size of countries by their population and adjusted for their landmass or geographical size. The bottom map then reports these countries or adjusts these countries by the amount of papers that they have had published in peer-reviewed journals in the area of physical activity. And you can see that the bottom map of the world is almost exclusively made up of high-income countries, those in pink, which means that we have very little evidence about physical activity, 24-hour movement behaviours among children, among all age groups from low and middle income countries. And we really need to address that. And I want to acknowledge some of the great work being done in Mexico in this area and providing much needed literature on these behaviours among children. But if we come back to now the environments that these children may be growing up in and how different things are in low and middle income countries and how this may be compromising the opportunities they have for a healthy lifestyle focused on healthy levels of physical activity, sedentary behaviour and sleep. If you grow up in an apartment building in many low and middle income countries, particularly in large urban areas, the environment surrounding these will look very different to what you see in a high income country. We need to consider how we plan for urban environments to be able to provide access to children to play outside in a safe and healthy and appropriate way. So you consider what you see here with what you might see in high-income countries like Australia, where there are many playgrounds that are built into the construction of these apartment blocks, or even a country like Chile, where playgrounds are, there are policies around the construction of playgrounds and the need for those to be in close proximity to where children live. If we think about the environments that are around even any type of urban area, urban dwelling within these countries, we can see that it's not very activity conducive. We can see that it is dangerous here on this photo at a number of levels, whether it be the pollution that you can see, or whether it be the fact that there is no equipment, nothing there that can really be attractive to a child to want to encourage them to play outside. In other cities, children who live above shops, like you see here in Vietnam, again, the only place where they may have to be active might be down on the footpath or the sidewalk that you see down below. And even that has been taken over by vendors, by those on motorcycles wanting to park their bike, which makes it very difficult for the children to be able to go down and play in that area without actually playing on the street. In many of these countries, children are not allowed outside, particularly without an adult supervision, to play because of the pollution that you see here from garbage, the pollution that exists the water pollution that may exist, and even some safety concerns like you see here in South Africa, which means that the area or the neighbourhood around it is not safe for children to play in. In some countries, like you see here in Sri Lanka, this is the capital city, Colombo, children who live in the apartment blocks that you see on the right-hand side of this photo do have access to a beach that is not far away. However, to get to that beach, you can see they have to cross a railway line, which is quite busy, and which there is no walkway to actually go across the railway line in a safe manner, which again makes it quite inaccessible to children. Even the simple act of being able to walk around the streets and to be able to have footpaths or sidewalks that promote physical activity and active transportation among children and families is not existent in many countries. You can see here in Indonesia, where urban planning has resulted in what were once perhaps sidewalks on the side of streets being replaced by extra lanes, which will allow more cars to use this to be able to get to places at the expense of people being able to walk. And that's a real concern when you're trying to promote less traffic on the roads, and particularly for short trips, promote more active transportation. And this really does make it challenging for that to occur. As I mentioned before, this is an example here from Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, where again, children might like to play with a ball or do some hopscotch or move around on the area between the road and the shops here. To do that, they would have to get up very early in the morning, because from an early hour, these vehicles begin to arrive. They begin to set up their goods, park motorcycles there, which again takes it out of reach of children if they want to play there. And there is really no safe space around here for children to play. Which then means that if children do want to walk around, they have to walk on the street, play on the street, which, as we know, is not very safe. You contrast that with what can happen in some lower middle income countries, like you see here in Brazil, where urban planners have paid particular attention to how they might set up the streets around the towns and cities to be able to promote physical activity. So little things here, like having crossings, 4 crossings, as you see here, at each intersection. And not just having 4 crossings, but these crossings lining up with the footpath. So as you walk down the footpath, it's a very easy transition to cross the street. And you're educating drivers as well about the importance of giving way to pedestrians at these crossings. In this city here, which is in the south west of Brazil, footpaths have been constructed to be very wide to allow people to be able to walk easily on those footpaths, and the cycleways have been constructed in other parts of the city, again, to promote active transportation. And that's an area that we do have to consider very carefully when we're trying to promote active living, 24-hour movement behaviours for our children, is the amount of time that they may spend in traffic getting to and from school or from places nowadays. And this traffic results in children in what we call restrained sitting for long periods of time. So they might have to sit down for at least half an hour in some large cities, like Dakar in Bangladesh. It's even longer, or Sao Paulo in Brazil. And they might be sitting in either a car, a rickshaw, or on a motorcycle for long periods of time, which again is not good for their health. And in addition to that, you can see that there are safety concerns, particularly if they don't wear helmets, and they're also being exposed to air pollution as part of this trip, which again is not good for their health. Once they travel to and from school or preschool, the environments there are also very important to consider. And we can see here in China that much attention and infrastructure has been devoted to ensuring that children have adequate access to safe play environments within preschool. And this is very important. And even in countries like China, where some of their kindergartens are very large, attention is given to this, and this is prioritised because the government understands the importance of a healthy, active lifestyle for children. And children do have access to these environments regularly throughout the day. Again, in countries like Australia, where initiatives such as ensuring children have adequate equipment, that there are line markings that are used, where children are able to access this space freely, promotes healthy, active lifestyles for these children. And the best example of this are in some Scandinavian countries like Norway, where again, these children have access to amazing outdoor facilities, are encouraged to take risks and to develop appropriate ways to be able to navigate their environments, and at the same time are encouraged and supported by their educators. You contrast this with what we see in some large urban areas in low and middle income countries, like you see here in Dhaka in Bangladesh, where this is the only play area for young children in their preschool. There is no outdoor play area at all. And so again, I do take my hats off to this preschool for ensuring that children have at least some space in which they can play, which is better than nothing. But again, we need to consider regulations such that when preschools are being built, that we make it mandatory that there be an outdoor play environment for those children to be able to be active in. Unfortunately, we also see in some settings like we see here in the subcontinent where there is an outdoor play area, but in this case, it's rarely being used because there were concerns from parents that children might be exposed to dengue fever from mosquitoes playing in the outdoor environment, even though doctors had indicated to them that this was not a risk at all and that there was no concern about the children playing inside. The parents didn't want their children to do that, so the preschool made a decision to close this space, particularly of an afternoon, which didn't allow the children the opportunity to be physically active, and reduce one of the opportunities they had in a period of the day when children really, it's really important for them to be active. So it's what we call a critical window, that sort of afternoon period. And they were replacing this, unfortunately, with lots of sedentary behaviour. Again, we see places which are quite, where there is quite a high concentration of the population within a specific area, like in Hong Kong. Again, the government has been mindful about how they might promote physical activity here. So even though there is no outdoor play centre in this preschool, again, what the educators have done is they've ensured that they can bring the children into the space and do some form of physical activity with them. But in addition to that, they've negotiated with the owners of the complex in which the preschool is located to be able to have access to a basketball court area outside. And they go and use that quite regularly as a way of providing opportunities for the children to be physically active. The other phenomenon that I've seen more recently, and this is particularly in many countries throughout Asia, is this push at a young age on academic pursuits. So there is a desire, particularly among parents, for children to be able to spend large amounts of time in academic enrichment activities, language development activities, like you see here. And this is a case here in a high-income country in Singapore, where children are enrolling, parents are enrolling their children in these language and maths enrichment classes, spending large amounts of money at doing this. And this is occurring for children as young as 3. And what this means is that the time when they would usually be active, be playing, and promoting a healthy, active lifestyle, they're in fact spending it sedentary in these enrichment activities, not recognising that there is an importance for And that's because many of these parents don't really value or see the importance of a healthy, active lifestyle for their children, which again comes back to the need for us to educate parents in this area. And in addition to that, we need to think about the environments, the indoor environments that these children are spending time in preschools, the amount of time that they might spend sitting, and thinking about ways that we can structure the environment to allow or promote more activity throughout the day, particularly if these children are spending large amounts of time indoors. And finally, the advent of handheld screen devices, particularly over the last 10 years, has opened up opportunities for children to be sedentary, to be engaged with screens from a very young age. And even though these handheld devices are different to television, one thing that is similar is that, in my experience, when children use these devices, most of the time they are being sedentary, as you see here in these photographs. And these devices not only promote sedentary or sitting behaviour and high amounts of time, because the apps that are designed to engage children, to keep them connected to a screen for long periods of time, and they are very attractive and appealing. But it also exposes children to advertisements that they see, and often these advertisements are for unhealthy foods and other things that are not appropriate to them for their age. And finally, sleep is an area that we know very little about. And there are some factors, particularly within low and middle income countries, that might be contributing to unhealthy levels of sleep, but are very hard to modify. So the amount of people in the family that sleep in the same room or in the same bed are very difficult to overcome. But there are some things that can be measured and that can impact on children's sleep behaviours that we might need to think about. Now, this is in a low-income country, Papua New Guinea, and this is in a sort of fairly rural city. But in this one here, there are nightclubs that are allowed to stay open all throughout the night that are actually in residential areas. And these nightclubs play loud music that can very easily be heard in bedrooms, that make it very difficult for children to be able to have a good quality sleep. And we have to consider other things like the traffic that exists here. And this traffic may often go late into the night when children are sleeping. Some people may say that children get used to this, but again, we have some good observational studies that show that the sleep quality among the children and the sleep duration is compromised. And then we think about, in many lower middle income countries, that the cooking sources here and the fumes and the smoke that gets given off there, and whether that might be polluting the children, polluting the house, and then compromising the children's sleep there as well. So what we need to do in response to this is think about ways in which we can promote healthy 24-hour movement behaviours. And the WHO, through their Global Action Plan for Physical Activity, have recommended that we consider all the levers that might be pulled to be able to promote healthy movement behaviours. And these include some of the things that I've spoken about the environments in which children live, about the policies that have been developed, about the way these policies and these environments and the way we might promote them through social media and participation events and workforce education and professional development may come together. And what is important here is that right from the start of this process, if we are going to look at ways in which, as a society, as a country, and even as a community, we might promote healthy levels of movement behaviours, is that we need to engage with stakeholders right from the very start. We need to work bottom up with communities to come up with solutions that are designed by themselves, that can be supported by themselves, that in fact can be implemented and encouraged and promoted by these communities themselves. And these have been shown to be far more sustainable and have much greater buy-in from the community if this occurs. As I mentioned before, in the WHO Commission on Ending Childhood Obesity, the recommendation was to provide guidance on these 24-hour movement behaviours for young children. And the WHO responded to that through these guidelines for children aged under 5, taking a 24-hour approach, and this whole idea of a healthy movement index, ensuring that children right from a young age get appropriate amounts of physical activity, sedentary behaviour and sleep. And these are for children, infants, children under the age of 1, to promote tummy time, accumulate up to 30 minutes a day there, that to not have any screen time, and to sleep between 14 and 17 hours for children up to 3 months of age, and 12 to 16 hours for children 4 to 11 months of age. For toddlers, the recommendation is 180 minutes of physical activity of any intensity. Any movement here is good. Screen time for children under 2 should still be 0, and children over 2 should be no more than 60 minutes a day, and 11 to 14 hours of good quality sleep. And children aged 3 and 4, 180 minutes of physical activity, of which 60 minutes should be moderate to vigorous activity or energetic play. Now that's a minimum here, so clearly more is better with these guidelines here. No more than 60 minutes of screen time. We've also added the guideline which is to not be restrained for more than an hour at a time, and that would be largely in a car seat or on the back of a motorcycle here, and 10 to 13 hours of good quality sleep. I want to finish my presentation with providing for you 2 examples of, firstly, how we can use technology to help children be more active and less sedentary, and secondly, how we might be able to engineer more physical activity and less sedentary behaviour into the environments where children spend time. The first program here is one that was developed by a former PhD student at Early Start at the University of Wollongong. And this was developed to overcome shortcomings of traditional face-to-face professional learning, particularly geographical challenges that we have in Australia being a large country, time constraints, associated costs of face-to-face workshops, and just this generic content of a one-size-fits-all approach. Few studies have investigated the feasibility and acceptability of what we call blended models in early childhood education and care. And that is synchronizing both, integrating synchronous and asynchronous platforms in the professional development. And this program here was designed to be able to evaluate the efficacy of a web-based professional learning program for early childhood educators. And these settings, early childhood education and care, are critical environments for the promotion of physical activity and healthy behaviours. But as I mentioned, professional learning for educators is limited in this space. And so we wanted to evaluate the efficacy of this program amongst educators and on the healthy eating and activity behaviours of children. We collected data, or Michelle collected data between February and December 2016. And the program itself was a 12-week blended professional learning program where there was a 1-day face-to-face workshop and then an online component which comprised synchronous. In other words, they would all get together much like you would on a Zoom chat and have these live chat sessions. This was before we had Zoom. And then we would have asynchronous ones where the educators could access the content on a website wherever they liked afterwards. And that was combined with visits to the site to be able to assess these outcomes and monitor the implementation of the intervention. We had 15 preschools or services that were randomised into 3 clusters. There were 5 services per cluster. Baseline data were collected on all children and services in February 2016. And then in March, cluster 1 participated, while the others just undertook normal practice. July, cluster 2. Cluster 1 would be their maintenance period then, and cluster 3 would be the normal practice. And then in September, the final cluster participated and the first 2 clusters were in their maintenance period. And then we collected final data in December 2016. We used accelerometry to measure the movement behaviours of children and the EPAO assessment tool. Now, this is an independent assessment. It's not a self-assessment by the educators, but it's called the Environment Policy and Observation Tool. And this was assessed by researchers who went into the services and assessed the child behaviours in both physical activity and sedentary behaviour, the staff behaviours, the centre environment for physical activity and nutrition. And that also included eating occasions, foods and beverages offered, staff behaviours, and a document review where the assessors looked at the menu, the guidelines around celebration foods for birthdays and special occasions, food linked to fundraising events, and written policies and whether they existed or not. Now, in this, we managed to retain all services in this study and around 80% of educators and over 90% of children. And what we see here is that there was a significant difference between the intervention and control groups at the end of the intervention for the EPAO in the physical activity area, and that this was maintained at the end of the maintenance period. And there was also a significant difference between the control and the intervention groups at the end of the maintenance period for the total EPAO score, which again was largely attributed to the changes in physical activity, and there were very few changes in nutrition. We also saw changes at the individual level in the child's movement behaviours, and in particular their light intensity physical activity. And this is the intensity which they would typically participate in throughout most of the day, with only a small proportion spent in moderate to vigorous activity. So we did see a significant difference in light intensity activity here between the control and intervention groups. And what's been interesting with these results is that they were significant at the end of the intervention period, but they stayed significant at the end of the 3-month maintenance period, where there was very little interaction that occurred between the researchers and the educators, and they were essentially continuing on with many of the changes that they had made during the intervention period. So the fact that these were maintained is something that we were really encouraged by. This is an example of the web-based forum of a collaborative professional conversation via a web-based forum between the educators and their managers. And the managers sit above the educators and are responsible for managing several of the preschools that were involved in this study. And this was a really good way in which the educators could consolidate the learning, that they could share the learning that had occurred, and that they were able to use that not only in encouraging other educators about how they had approached some of these challenges and some of the changes that they were making, and that resulted in a really nice community of practice that developed among the educators, where they could share ideas, thinking, and help one another with overcoming some of the challenges. The other area now is, and I want to turn the focus here to how we might reduce sedentary behaviour, particularly in primary schools, middle schools and high schools. And in the state that I come from, New South Wales in Australia, there's been a recent initiative around the actual learning environments in which children spend time. And there is an approach that's been promoted within our state education department around the flexibility within learning spaces, and how we can have learning spaces that can be created to provide more opportunities or better opportunities for students to learn. And this was being implemented. And so what we did as researchers is we worked with the education department to be able to measure not just the learning that occurred, and that was what the education department were most interested in: time on task, things around whether students were distracted, whether students were able to work more effectively in groups, whether teachers were able to promote better learning environments. We were interested in that, and we were able to assess that for the education department. But what we were most interested in was what impact it might have on their sedentary behaviour. Because if the environments in the classrooms promoted more flexibility, would they also promote more standing, more stepping, more moving around, and less sitting time which was something of interest. So this has been written up and published last year by another PhD student who was working on this project with us. So just to give you some idea of the differences. So a traditional classroom, you would see it would look something like this. You've got limited furniture options. You've got your standard desks and chairs. They're laid out in rows usually. They might be shaped in a U, but essentially they're all facing the front of the classroom. And the pedagogies that are used here, in addition to the spaces, are largely teacher-centred. So there's direct instruction. There's a board at the front that the teacher uses to be able to explain things, or they might use a PowerPoint. And most of the students are working individually on tasks. In contrast, a flexible learning space has a much greater range of furniture options, and you can see some of those on display here. This is in a high school classroom. They're laid out flexibly, so there's some group desks, there's some individual desks. Again, if students want to work in groups or individually, they have the opportunity to do that. And there's no real front of the classroom, as you see here. All the resources that might be used are movable: the whiteboards, the walls, the desks, the laptops, etc. And the pedagogy that drives this is largely student-centred. So there's a mix of collaborative work and individual work as well. And what we found in this study, where we actually compared schools which had a traditional approach or traditional classrooms with those that had flexible learning spaces. And this is in high schools here. And in these high schools, some of the high schools had flexible learning spaces and some had traditional spaces. So they had a mix of the two. And what we did here was we actually controlled for the content of the lesson and for the teacher as well. So we got the teachers to teach some lessons in a traditional classroom to the same students, and then we got them to teach other lessons to the same students in a flexible learning classroom. And then we also got these teachers to teach the same lesson to different groups of students, one lesson in a flexible learning space and one in a traditional classroom. And what we see here is that the differences between the two spaces were quite significant and quite large here. So this is here over a 50-minute lesson. And you can see here that the proportion of time spent in sitting, standing and stepping was significantly different between the two. So we're talking about much higher proportions of time spent in standing and much lower proportions of time spent in sitting. And standing is quite different to sitting. It's not a sedentary behaviour. And physiologically, they're quite different. So if we can, particularly among some students who may do little physical activity, if we can replace sitting with standing, then that's going to be beneficial to their health. And where we saw most of these differences was actually in female students. Again, we know that females are less active than males, particularly during adolescence, and there is a much greater decline in physical activity among adolescent girls or females compared with males. So there's a way that we can address that. And if there's a way that we can do this that's going to be easy to incorporate into current initiatives that are being done within education departments and that are being done for different reasons, and these were being done, as I said before, to promote better learning and better educational outcomes, then we can have an effect on physical activity and movement behaviours almost by stealth. And not only did we see these changes in the students, but we also saw the changes in the teachers. And this final slide shows that we had accelerometers, or active PAL accelerometers, on the teachers here as well as the students. And we can see here that this is in primary school. So primary school teachers who taught classes in a traditional setting and then in a flexible learning space. And we can see here that the proportion of time they spent sitting and standing was quite different across those two classrooms. So it's good for the teacher's health as well. So in closing, I wanted to thank you for this opportunity to present to you about 24-hour movement behaviours, about their importance in trying to prevent and address the high and increasing levels of overweight and obesity among our children, and some ways in which that has been done, which has been quite effective and that is quite promising, I think, within both preschool settings and also school settings. And I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.